Hey everybody, it's Rapid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be doing our next top tier review, and that is the nation of Russia, which won the last poll. After this video goes live, I will put up another poll for what's going to be the next nation, and as a reminder on that, I'm only reviewing the nations that I have all three trees in: helicopter, plane, and ground, because I want to have a full understanding of what the tech tree looks like beforehand. As a bit of a side note, for the purposes of this video, while the tech tree is technically called the Soviet tech tree, it's often simply referred to as the Russian tech tree, and of course the Russian vehicles at top tier are largely Russian Federation, not older Soviet models, so we'll be referring to it as the Russian tech tree for the remainder of this video. And as just a brief refresher, this is the grading system we're going to be using. S is going to be the best in category, A very good, B average, C poor, and F is nothing suitable, and we will be grading the vehicles in descending order in terms of importance, so the first will be the most important and the last category will be the least important. And as always, the first category will be the main battle tanks. Now Russia actually has three families of main battle tanks: the T-72, the T-90, and the T-80. However, the strengths and weaknesses of these three families of tanks are essentially the same. It's just a question of to what degree they affect the tanks. So we're going to do the strengths and weaknesses first and then go into the tanks themselves. For the pros of Russian MBTs, they have excellent frontal armor profiles, good side armor profiles, and powerful high explosive shells. For the cons, they have slow reload, poor gun handling, and poor reverse gears. Now, as far as the excellent frontal armor profiles, one important thing to remember in terms of Russian MBTs is that while the specifics will change in terms of the exact type of armor going from Contact 5 to Relic, etc., the weak points themselves rarely see any significant change in terms of thickness or in terms of size. That being said, the driver's hatch, lower front plate, and turret ring, which are the biggest weak points on your average Russian tank, and to an extent the roof right above the gun breech, are somewhat small weak points and very inconsistent to hit, especially if you're snapshotting, which gives Russian tanks a very good reaction window against enemies at close range. Additionally, in terms of the lateral protection, most Russian tanks around this battle rating are going to have at least Contact 5, if not the heavy Relic bags on the side, and this makes Russian tanks somewhat resistant to autocannons to the side, and heat rounds especially, and in rare instances they can even eat things like darts, especially at sharp angles. Of course, if the armor package alone was the biggest factor in Russian tanks, it wouldn't be as important. However, it is augmented by a somewhat favorable damage model that allows for rather goofy hits, like hits to the lower front plate, only taking out the driver and engine and not taking out any of the crew and ammo in between. And to round out the pros, all of the Russian tanks at top tier come with powerful high explosive rounds. You can even use this in lieu of the heat rounds that you start off with on some of these tanks stock, and these high explosive rounds can knock out tanks by hitting things like turret rings, cupolas, and can allow you to take out enemies even in situations where you otherwise couldn't. For all of those pros, the cons are fairly substantial. However, the elevation and depression speed in particular is incredibly abysmal for a top tier tank, and this means in maps with a lot of elevation, Russian tanks can often struggle to react quickly enough, on top of the fact that their traverse speeds are not exactly exceptional to begin with. On top of that, their reloads are also fairly poor: 7.1 seconds on the T-90 and T-72s and 6.7 seconds on the T-80s. Any NATO tank with a good crew can out-reload them, and this gives Russian tanks some of effectively the worst guns at their respective battle ratings. Although they're not unusable, they are just the slowest to react and the slowest to reload. On top of that, the reverse speeds are abysmal. The T-90 and T-72 have a whopping 4 kph. This will actively get you killed in some situations if you whiff a shot. The T-80 is a little more generous, going up to a little over 10 kph, but it's still not great. The key takeaway from that, however, is that the T-80s actually have the least pronounced drawbacks. Their reload is a little faster than the other Russian tanks, and their reverse speed is also a little faster, on top of the T-80s having a generally better engine and better power to weight ratio, and this makes the T-80s the, well, least Russian tanks, I guess is the way you would put it. The Russian tanks stand in stark contrast to the American tanks, because while the Abrams series is mostly active advantages with very few passive advantages, the Russian tanks go in almost the complete opposite direction, with lots of passive advantages and very few active advantages. And as we discussed a bit with the Abrams, passive advantages tend to be better in the hands of average to below average players, whereas active advantages tend to be a lot better in the hands of above average or great players. In that respect, the Russian T-series runs into the same problem as the Americans in terms of you will see a pretty pronounced difference in terms of how well the tanks perform with both the best players and the worst players. In general, when the armored Apex, we saw the Russian tanks saw basically no play, whereas the American tanks were absolutely top pick. That being said, in a 15 vs 15 random queue, the Russian tank's passive advantages of just being able to survive hits they have no business surviving, even if the player themselves isn't the best, is certainly a noticeable advantage, because it will keep your team in the fight longer and at least doing something, even if that something is just getting shot at more. On the whole, I would broadly grade the Russian MBT lineup as an A-rank lineup. The big reason that it's going with A instead of B is actually the T80 BVM. The T80 BVM combines the best of both worlds in that it has the relic armor both on the front and on the sides, and it also has the T80 advantages of stronger mobility and a faster reload, and manages to mix them all in a very excellent package. It's one of the best tanks in the game. However, the T90 and T72 families are noticeably worse, and even tanks like the T80U do see a noticeable step down in terms of overall capabilities. So while I do consider the T80 BVM to be an absolutely top tank, the rest of the lineup is somewhat lacking, so I think a grade A is fine on the whole, especially because the lineup will stay in the fight longer than lineups without good passive advantages. Next up we have anti-air, and while there are technically two options, the 2S6 Tunguska and the Pantsir S1, the Pantsir S1 is the obvious winner, at least in terms of anti-aircraft capabilities. For the pros of the Pantsir, you have the best track and search radar in the entire game, you have the best missiles in the game, and you have 12 of them ready to fire. You can also fire the missiles while moving, and you have 4 30mm cannons with very high velocity and a very good spread, and also a very good rate of fire. For the cons of the Pantsir, it is very big and very slow, and also lacks versatility when engaging ground targets. And going through those pros real quick, the radar has an excellent tracking capability and goes into a very high arc, so it can even see aircraft above you most of the time. On top of that, you also have multi-target tracking and semi-automatic lead, and also a really good IRST mode. There just isn't any feature you would fundamentally want on a radar right now that the Pantsir doesn't have. Its missiles are the fastest and longest range, and of course 12 of them ready to fire is always really solid, and most anti-air cannot shoot while moving at all, especially with missiles, unless they're IR missiles. The Pantsir can shoot its missiles while moving with no problem, and of course you can use this feature to make yourself a harder target to hit with things like GPS guided bombs while still engaging the enemy effectively, on top of the fact that the guns are both powerful, fast firing, and have a great spread, so any low flying aircraft you can easily hit even without the assistance of the radar. The lack of versatility on the Pantsir is somewhat noticeable because the Pantsir is a big heavy truck, but also the mounting system for its weapons doesn't exactly go down at all, especially over the front of the vehicle, and if you fire the 4 30mm cannons over the side, you're going to experience considerable recoil as they will absolutely rock the very light truck that they are currently mounted on. I wouldn't rate it as the worst anti-air in terms of engaging ground targets. In fact, it is actually slightly better than the Ito in a lot of situations, but it certainly isn't particularly good, and I wouldn't go out hunting ground targets if you can avoid it. The Pantsir is likely going to be the easiest S rank of this entire series. It is comfortably the best anti-air in the game. I don't think anybody is really under any delusions that it isn't. To put it very simply, if you need to shoot down a plane and you can't do it with the Pantsir, the likelihood is very high that it simply can't be done. Next up we have the light tank lineup for Russia, and these are all pretty different, so we're kind of going to have to cover them all individually real quick. The Tech-Tree 2S25M has a really powerful shell in the 3BM60 and is a fairly lightweight and agile frame with good thermals in both the commander and gunner sight. The 2S38 is a versatile premium vehicle that can engage both air and ground targets, and with a half-second reload can fire fairly rapidly and efficiently engage both, especially if it gets off a flank on ground targets. Lastly, the BMP-2M squadron vehicle has a very fast rate of fire on its 30mm cannon, and couples that with 4 ready-to-fire missiles that it can shoot while moving and that can kill any target in the game. Honorable mention goes to the old event vehicle, the BMD-4, which is also a pretty competitive top-tier light tank. However, it's unobtainable by most players, and so we're not really going to be discussing it all that much. The overall pros of this lineup is that you have multiple vehicles with multiple different profiles and weapon systems, but all of their weapons are generally acceptable for a top-tier environment, so all of them are competitive in the game, even at 11.7 and above. The closest thing to a real con is that for light tanks, their mobility isn't all that exceptional, and the reverse gears on the whole tend to be pretty bad outside of the 2S25, which has a respectable reverse gear. In terms of giving a grade on this selection of vehicles, I was tempted to go with an A, but honestly I think this is just going to be an S grade, and part of the reason is not just the capabilities of individual vehicles, while all of them are quite good. It more comes down to the options and the amount of things you can do with this lineup. No matter what weapons you prefer, a reasonably fast-firing autocannon, a fast-firing autocannon plus missiles, or a slower-firing cannon with a powerful shell, this lineup can provide, and all of these platforms, while not super mobile, are mobile enough for most situations. That being said, the real standout of the Russian light tank lineup is absolutely the BMP-2M, and there are two main reasons for it. The first one is the very fast-firing cannon that can shred through things like lateral armor, which is increasingly getting heavier on tanks. If you have to punch through things like ERA, you want as fast as a rate of fire as possible, possible so you can shred the ERA and then start working at the crew underneath. Additionally, the 4 ready-to-fire missiles that can all be fired while moving and have over 1200 millimeters of penetration with a tandem warhead gives you the unique capability to simply fly around the corner at top speed and shotgun even the heaviest tanks in the face with these missiles and take them out. By the time you get to top tier, the trend is more on slower firing cannons and things like the Spike ER, which you have very little control over and that often doesn't work that well at close quarters. The BMP-2M circumvents both of these by simply having a fast firing gun and missiles that you can always control and always hit targets with that can reliably take out any target even from the front. All of this combines means the BMP-2M is the #1 squadron vehicle I would recommend somebody research for ground vehicles, and even if you don't have a squadron, it might even be worth GEing it because it is just that good and that useful. And for our next category, we have the Russian helicopters. There are actually 2 options at top tier that are reasonably similar in a lot of respects. These are the Mi-28NM and the Ka-52. For pros, you have a large inventory of the most versatile and powerful general purpose missiles in the game. You also have some of the most powerful rockets in the game. You have a fast firing and high velocity 30mm autocannon, and they also feature radar to detect air and ground targets. For cons, they are somewhat expensive to spawn and lack fire and forget missiles. For the pros, the Vakir missile is one of the most infamous missiles in the game at this point. It has a tandem warhead and also has a proximity fuse, so it's effective at engaging both air and ground targets, although the missile doesn't turn that well, so against planes, unless they're coming directly at you, the Vakir probably isn't going to be that useful. However, it is really effective against things like helicopters. Both helicopters can also carry the Igla missiles, which is a pretty effective air-to-air missile. It's noticeably more reliable than things like the Stinger and the Mistral. However, this is also where we see one of the biggest differences between the 2 helicopters. The Mi-28NM only has 2 pylons for missiles that has to be split between air-to-air and air-to-ground, whereas the Ka-52 has 2 pylons that can carry the anti-tank missiles and also 2 pylons for the anti-air missiles, giving the Ka-52 a total capacity of 12 Vakirs and 8 Iglas, which is pretty significant, especially when compared with the Mi-28NM. Both helicopters also feature some of the most powerful early spawn rockets in the game and combine this with a good 30mm cannon, making both of them brutally effective first spawns. Although the Ka-52 and the Mi-28 do have some minor differences in this area. The Mi-28 has a gimbal mounted 30mm, so it's better at engaging targets at a wider arc, whereas the Ka-52 is limited to the side, although it does still move from the side. However, the Ka-52's damage model is noticeably more insane than the Mi-28's and can easily eat whole teams worth of firepower and keep going. On the whole though, one of the scariest things you can hear at the start of a match is the whir of Russian helicopter blades, because both of these will take a sizable chunk out of your team if nobody first spawned in AA. The radar is actually where we see the last difference. The Ka-52 is actually limited to a frontal arc for its radar, whereas the Mi-28 actually has a mass-mounted radar, so it can scan in a much larger area. Although this isn't relevant in all matches, the Ka-52's radar is more than enough in most situations. In terms of the cons, if you have missiles that have a range of 6 kilometers or more, you will get a spawn cost tax on those missiles, and the Vakirs get an additional tax for being proximity fused, so this does stack and make them one of the more expensive helicopters to spawn. However, this isn't that bad, and most of the time you can still spawn them pretty easily. Both helicopters also lack fire and forget missiles that are increasingly in vogue with the Spike ERs and the earlier model PARs on the German helicopters. However, this isn't that much of a disadvantage as most helicopters in the game still lack these weapons. Out of these 2 helicopters, the Ka-52 is easily the most common, and there are several reasons for this. The first one is that the Ka-52 is just easier to research. There are less steps between it and the other helicopters, and this is important as the helicopter RP is still pretty ridiculous right now. On top of that, the Ka-52 being able to carry all the Vakirs and the Iglas makes it a lot more versatile, and of course the damage model is still quite busted, so even though it does have some minor drawbacks versus the Mi-28NM, it is still easily the most popular pick. This was the category that I went back and forth the most on because I wanted to see for myself how good the Ka-52 really was in the current meta. Obviously when it was first introduced and for a long time afterwards, it was the most broken thing in the entire game. It was almost impossible to contest, and the only reason it would ever die is if it made a mistake. That being said, the Spike ER fire and forget missiles present a pretty considerable threat to a Ka-52, and additionally thermal targeting pods helps target things like Mavericks against them a lot more easily, and of course you have the addition of missiles like the AMRAAM that can take them out more easily than older model missiles. That being said, my experience with the Ka-52 was that just because you can counter it doesn't mean it's not the best, so I will give it a firm S grade. While certainly certain weapons or certain vehicles being up is something the Ka-52 has to be aware of, it has the broadest tool set of any helicopter in the game. You can use it as an early spawn and put a huge dent in the entire enemy team. You can use it as a mid-game spawn and use it to help try and secure a victory for your team. And if the game does get to the point where both teams are light on players and light on spawns, a Ka-52 can easily shut a game down completely on its own. Fundamentally, the Ka-52 doesn't really have any weaknesses other than weaknesses that you could easily apply to basically any other helicopter, and it does have the most versatile array of weapons that allow it to basically perform well anywhere, so I can't really give this any lower grade than S, although it's not as blatantly overpowered as it was when it first entered the game. For the next category, we're grading the Russian fixed-wing CAS, and the Russian fixed-wing CAS is somewhat complicated. I'm going to go over the pros and cons first, because there are some elements of the pros and cons that need to be understood before we start talking about specific aircraft. For pros, you have some of the most powerful long-range fire and forget air-to-ground missiles in the entire game, and for cons, you have very poor targeting systems and very few multi-role aircraft. Russian aircraft very prominently feature the Kh-29TE, which is one of the most powerful and longest range optically guided missiles in the entire game, and also feature the Kh-38MT, which is one of the longest range and most powerful infrared guided missiles in the entire game. Both of these are fire and forget missiles, and assuming nothing happens between launch and impact, they will reliably kill anything in the entire game. Of course, by anything, I mostly mean ground vehicles and helicopters, although I did actually hit a plane with a Kh-38 once. It was pretty funny, although they mostly just made a mistake. For the cons, the targeting systems on Russian planes, where they even exist, are fairly poor. Very few Russian planes have things like night vision or infrared, and pretty much all of their targeting systems have very poor FOVs to the left and right, and what this means is that unlike NATO aircraft that tend to have very good targeting pods, Russian aircraft can't really orbit the battlefield to try and find targets before they set up an attack run. You mostly just have to point your nose at the battlefield and start trying to figure out what you want to attack as the enemy is already probably trying to kill you. This also brings up the other point in that the only targeting pod on a Russian aircraft right now is the Mercury targeting pod, and the Mercury targeting pod doesn't really improve the FOV of the aircraft that much. It just improves it mostly in a downward angle. The left and right visibility is still poor, and all it realistically adds over the normal targeting systems on the Su-25s it's equipped with is a night vision capability, which is only really useful if you have night maps enabled. While the Mercury currently represents the only night vision system available for Russian targeting systems, the only thermal targeting system is currently on the Su-25 SM-3. Nothing else has this capability. This also means that identifying targets in maps that have very dense terrain and also in low light conditions is incredibly difficult for the vast majority of Russian aircraft. Expanding on that further, Russia also deeply lacks multi-role aircraft, that is, aircraft that can effectively engage both air and ground targets with the same loadout. And let's start with a few examples. If you look at a lot of the Russian strike aircraft, they're stuck with missiles like the R-60M, or maybe if they're lucky, the R-73. Both of these are some of the shortest range IR missiles in the game outside of things like the SRAM, and these missiles really struggle to hit targets outside of 2 kilometers, which makes them almost purely defensive missiles unless you can chase the enemy down. However, most of the aircraft equipped with these missiles don't exactly have the flight performance to go around chasing fighters, so on the whole they are purely defensive, which means that if the enemy has air up that you want to deal with, most of these aircraft are simply not going to be up to the task. Conversely, the loadout of most of the planes that actually have good air-to-air missiles, things like R-27Rs and R-77s, are really on aircraft that don't have precision-guided munitions, the types you would really want in a top-tier match. The only real exception to this would be the Su-25SM and the MiG-29 SMT, that both feature Kh-29s and can also carry R-77s. That being said, both of those planes also lack any real targeting system, so you're basically just stuck with a basic targeting system on the Kh-29 itself, which is a pretty poor quality optical targeting system. I went back and forth with what I would realistically consider the Russian CAS grade, especially after trying a bunch of the aircraft and realizing a lot of their limitations. Ultimately, I settled on a B grade just because the Su-25 SM-3 with the Kh-38 does exist and is a very powerful aircraft, but if it wasn't for that, this would comfortably be a C grade CAS lineup. Russian fixed-wing CAS, at least in my experience, is a lot less about picking the best possible option and more about trying to find features that you like and disadvantages that you can live with. In this respect, while there are a large number of options that you can potentially go with both at 11.7 and below and even up to 12.7, it doesn't really excel and honestly isn't that notable outside of the one plane with the one missile. And lastly, and definitely least, we have the tank destroyer category, and the only real option for Russia for tank destroyers at top tier is the Chrysanthema. The pros of the Chrysanthema that it features powerful long-range missiles and also a radar to help guide those missiles. The cons are everything else essentially. With 1200 millimeters of penetration and a tandem warhead, the missiles can destroy any vehicle in the game at any range from any angle, which is always nice to have, and the ground radar is actually reasonably good at locking and hitting targets at longer ranges, although it's not the best and it can sometimes get a little confused. The platform all of this is mounted on, however, is fairly abysmal. The Chrysanthemum is not the fastest vehicle in the world in forward or reverse gears. It's somewhat agile just because it is so light. The problem is that while the missiles are mounted very high up on the vehicle, the targeting system is mounted on the hull, so you don't get a lot of great opportunities to use the missiles being mounted high like you do with a vehicle like the Mephisto. Additionally, the missiles themselves have a fairly poor traverse arc and traverse speed, and also have incredibly poor depression angles, and the poor depression angles does become a bit of an issue because even though you can technically fire the missiles while your vehicle is angled slightly up, the missiles have to swing back down to get within your field of fire, and this often leads to them slamming into the ground, or at certain ranges makes targets incredibly difficult to hit because you have to allow for the correction. This can also result in scenarios where enemies are on the other side of a small depression from you and are effectively impossible to hit because your missiles can't swing back down fast enough. The Chrysanthemum for me was a pretty easy C-grade tank destroyer. It's kind of the opposite of the Mephisto. The Mephisto had an excellent chassis but just didn't have the missiles to make use of it. The Chrysanthemum has excellent missiles but doesn't have the chassis for the missiles to really shine. In this respect, I found the Chrysanthemum was even more map specific than a normal tank destroyer, as you need positions that you can get to without having exceptional mobility, and those positions need to account for both your poor depression and your sight positioning, and this just didn't happen often enough for me to consider these as anything more than the bare minimum of a vehicle. Now for Russian top tier lineups, I feel like the lineup down below is pretty much the lineup you're going to see most of the time, with two exceptions. The first exception is the T-72B3. I mostly just include it because the relic bags allow it to be a bit of a brick house and allow to tank shots that other tanks normally can't, but it's not the greatest vehicle and could easily be subbed out with something like a T-80U and probably be about the same. The other option is the Su-27SM. The only reason that's in the lineup is because the Su-27 is a cool plane. It's not the greatest, but it is pretty fun and I do kind of like it. And to briefly go through some closing thoughts before I give Russia a grade as a whole, I can't help but feel that a lot of players really underestimate the impact of the Pantsir. I've said it before, but having good anti-air doesn't just mean you're good at protecting your team from air. It means you can more easily remove threats to your own aircraft, and this allows your own aircraft more freedom of movement and more ability to be more impactful than they would be otherwise. In this respect, not only does the Pantsir make Russian teams hard to deal with your own aircraft, it also props up some of their fixed wing cast that would otherwise be mediocre to bad. One other big factor I noticed, and this is likely just a result of the amount of designers' attention that Russian ground gets, basically every category for the Russian ground lineup has a backup option that is only a little bit worse than the main option. There's over a half dozen MBTs you could use, and all of them have some of the same advantages and disadvantages. There are quite a few light tanks that you could drop in your lineup that are all very usable at top tier, and even if you drop the Pantsir down to a 2S6, it's a noticeably less powerful anti-aircraft system, but it's not completely useless. Even dropping something like the Ka-52 down to a Mi-28NM isn't exactly going to be debilitating for the lineup. Basically, no matter what you hit, there's always another option, and this is part of the reason why, even as the new generation of Leopards makes the Russian MBTs less powerful than they used to be, Russia still remains a powerful and relevant opponent in top tier. In that respect, it is hard to give Russia anything but an S grade. While there definitely are some individually outstanding vehicles in the lineup, I feel like it's easy to underestimate how much the depth of the Russian lineup impacts its ability to play a top tier match, and additionally how well a lot of these platforms cover a lot of the other platforms' weaknesses and make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And that wraps up our video for today. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of fun comments because Russian top tier is obviously a very hot topic in the War Thunder community, but of course I do always love reading those comments regardless, so keep them coming. Additionally, I will have the poll up as soon as this goes live for the next nation. The only two options I currently have left to do are Israel and China, so make sure to check those out. If you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, don't forget to choose.